Welcome to Jewish History Soundbites podcast with Yehuda Geberer. Immerse yourself in the rich tapestry of Jewish history as we explore fascinating tales and uncover hidden gems from our glorious past. Brought to you by our proud sponsor, Cross River, a leader at the intersection of financial services and technology, committed to empowering the communities they serve. Cross River's steadfast support fuels our mission to preserve our heritage and foster a vibrant future for all. Contact Cross River through their website at crossriver.com.
A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger.
The 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany. The Olympic Games.
Zugerechtbare Brüder in Amerika. Von 1000 Shabbos at this guitar.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little, it is never too late, and it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide.
With Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode is going to discuss the life and times of Rav Yechiel Michel Epstein, more known by his very, very famous halachic work, the Aruch Hashulchan, longtime rabbi of Novardok, and his place in Jewish history. The book that I use, anyone who studies the Aruch Hashulchan today, the last couple of years, is obviously going to be the very well done book called Ta'aroich Lefonai Shulchan in Hebrew by Rabbi Eitam Henkin, Hashem Yinkem Damai, who was tragically killed, he and his wife, in a terrorist attack several years ago, and he was 31. He was a young and budding researcher who accomplished, it's quite humbling actually to see how much he accomplished in his short life. Enormous amount of writing and essays and halacha and Torah and history and everything. And he didn't publish the book. He left files of some of the prepared research, which was taken by my good friend Eliezer Brutt. He worked on it and added much of his own vast knowledge and research. And I guess the book is a collaborative effort between Reb Eitam Henkin and Eliezer Brutt. And it's fantastic. To the best of my knowledge, it's not yet translated to English, but it should be, because it's a great book about the Aruch Hashulchan, and as far as I know, there is no other great book about the Aruch Hashulchan out there. So it's great. If you're curious about this personality and his life and times, then you may want to purchase it and read it. If you want to wait till it's translated into English, then hopefully one day it will be. In any event, that's what I used for this episode. So we have the Aruch Hashulchan, Rav Yechiel Michel Epstein, who's born in 1829 in Bobruisk, which is today in Belarus, then was in the Russian Pale of Settlement. And his life trajectory is a pretty, he's standard Litvish, yeshivish for that time, for the 19th century. He grows up in this town, in Bobruisk, which is a fairly large Jewish city, and he goes to study in Volozhin for 2 years approximately. Rav Itzela of Volozhin, the son of the founder of Chaim Volozhiner, was the Rosh Yeshiva at the time, so this is relatively early on. And he returns to Bobruisk. He marries the daughter of Rabbi Yaakov Berlin in Mir, who was the father, of course, of the Netziv, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who was later the Rosh Yeshiva of Alazhin, who was the son-in-law of Rabbi Itzel of Alazhin. So Rabbi Yaakov Berlin was a relatively wealthy businessman in Mir, right? The Netziv was born in Mir, and the Aruch Hashulchan marries the Netziv's sister, the daughter of Rabbi Yaakov Berlin, lives for a short time in Mir following his marriage, and he moves back to Bobruisk. By the way, just so we get things a little more confusing, so the Netziv was the Aruch Hashulchan's brother-in-law, and he was also his son-in-law. So, like I said, the Netziv had married in his first marriage the daughter of Rabbi Itzel of Alazhin, whereas the Aruch Hashulchan had married the sister of the Netziv, the daughter of Rabbi Yaakov Berlin. But the Netziv's first wife passed away, and he marries his niece, the daughter of the Aruch Hashulchan. In other words, the Netziv's sister's daughter. So that's his second marriage, and he has a couple of kids from that marriage. Yaakov Berlin, named for his father, and also Meir Berlin, later Meir Bar Ilan. That's the youngest child of the Netziv. So Meir Bar Ilan grows up in his father. The Netziv passed away when he was a child still, so he grows up in his grandfather, the Aruch Hashulchan's house. In fact, Mivalazhin ad Yerushalayim, the memoir of Meir Bar Ilan, has quite a bit of information about the Aruch Hashulchan, about growing up in his home, and about how he served as rabbi of Novardok and everything. So it's very interesting. So the Netziv had this close relationship with his brother-in-law and father-in-law, the Aruch Hashulchan. Either way, after the Aruch Hashulchan's marriage to I don't remember her name now, but she has a name. I've neglected to put it in my notes. In Miss Berlin, and he moves back to Bobruisk after spending a short time in Mir, and he emerges as this young, brilliant scholar, and he has his mentor is this Rabbi Yoel Goldberg, who's also a Talmud of Alazhin, who is serving as the rabbi in Bobruisk at this time, and he eventually becomes his assistant. So he's kind of like a assistant rabbi in his hometown of Bobruisk. He serves as a dayan on the Bezdin in Bobruisk for a bunch of years until he is appointed to his first rabbinical position in the town of Novozybkov, something along those lines. The question how to pronounce it in Russian, in Belarusian, in Yiddish. Each one had their own pronunciation of this town. Either way, it was this town in what's today southern Belarus, near the Ukrainian border. It was it's interesting. The Aruch Hashulchan was a real Litvak. Of course, came from a very, very Litvish family, studied in Volozhin, marries into the Berlin family, which is a very Litvish family, was a Litvish Rav his entire life. But he always had a connection to the Hasidic community because Bobruisk had a very, very large Hasidic presence. It had a very large Chabad presence. And then later, Novozybkov, his first rabbinical position, was an almost entirely Hasidic community. It was partly Chabad and partly Chernobyl. In fact, the sefer that he published, Arla Yesharim, while he was the rabbi in Novozybkov, was he published haskamas, approbations from the different Chernobyl rebbes in Ukraine that was the big rabbis in the area. He also had haskamas from Lithuanian rabbis, but he had from both. In any event, so he had a close affiliation with the Hasidic community throughout his life. Novardok had a Hasidic contingent as well, not as prominent as the Novozybkov or Bobruisk, but nevertheless. In any event, he's the rabbi there from 1864 to 1874 for 10 years. And in 1874, he is appointed as the prestigious position as the rabbi of Novardok, which was a large Litvish town, not far from Mir, not far from Lida, from Radin, Baranovich, all these prominent Jewish cities in the area. So Novardok was a very large and famous and old Jewish town. And previously they had very prestigious rabbis earlier. In fact, one of them was Rav Yechiel Michel, who was later famous as the Kovner Rav. So in 1874, he becomes the rabbi and remains there for the rest of his life till his passing in 1908. In other words, for the last 34 years of his life. Quite a long rabbinical career in general, and specifically in his last place in Novardok. In fact, on the trips that I take to Belarus, we very often stop in Novardok, and we go up the hill. It's this old area. Today, I mean, still a large town, but it's very poor, the whole area. It's not a small shtetl, it's a large town, not a city either. It's somewhere in between, one of those type of places. And up on a hill is the old Jewish cemetery, and unfortunately it's been mostly destroyed. There are, random tombstones just lying around there. Unfortunately, between the Nazis and the Soviets, not many Jewish cemeteries in that area survived. And there's this big, large plaque of dedicated to the Jewish community in Novardok that was wiped out in the Holocaust. And on there it also specifically notes that the famous rabbi of Novardok was the Aruch Hashulchan, Rav Yechiel Michel Epstein, and he was buried here in this cemetery. So we don't actually have a cover of his that we go to, but the same idea. We go and pay our respects in that way. Now, during his time in Novardok, he gained world renown. He was very, very prominent as a posek. He was one of the most important halachic decisors in the whole Russian Empire, in the whole Russian Pale of Settlement, was respected as a leader, was very beloved by the Novardok Jewish community and the surrounding areas. Young Torah scholars would flock to him to get rabbinical ordination. He was known as the great masmich, the one who gave out smicha to many, many, many of the young aspiring rabbis. So you could have his legacy and his influence was felt in generations to come because so many prominent rabbis throughout Russia and even throughout the world, it was an age of immigration, received smicha from him. And then we have his written legacy. So there, like I mentioned, Orla Yesharim, he wrote several other svarim as well. There's also tshuvas from him, halachic responsa, but his magnum opus is, of course, what his name is, the Aruch Hashulchan, which was a very, very ambitious publishing endeavor and writing. It took him decades to write and even longer to publish, both because of financial constraints as well as the Czarist Russian censors. But it was a very, very ambitious project because it was he authored it on all areas of halacha. In fact, it's hard to find any other sefer halacha that was written since the time of the Rambam, since the Rambam himself, in other words, which is 800 years earlier or so, 700-800 years earlier, that was so all-encompassing, especially if we include what's sometimes referred to as the Shulchan Aruch HaAsid, which he also wrote but did not publish. It was published many years after his passing, posthumously, however you pronounce it, but well after his passing. He never referred to it as the Shulchan Aruch HaAsid, as far as I know. I'm sorry, Aruch Hashulchan HaAsid. Aruch Hashulchan HaAsid, right? Aruch Hashulchan HaAsid. He referred to it as additional volumes as Aruch Hashulchan in his writings. But the publishers decided when they published it to call it, they referred to it as the Aruch Hashulchan HaAsid, which covers areas of Tyrus and Kutshim and Karbanis and Beis Hamikdash and Tumah and all those areas that are relevant only in halacha for the time when there is a Beis Hamikdash. But especially if we include that, all those areas of halacha. But even if not, the fact that he wrote on everything, the whole area of Chayshir Mishpat, Even Ezer, Arachayim, Yeridea, and even many other areas that the Shulchan Aruch himself doesn't cover, that only the Rambam covers, really ambitious, a really an incredible accomplishment in halacha, a historic accomplishment, because there's no other multi-volume halachic work since the Rambam that really covers all that. That's his, and then he wrote quite a few other svarim as well, which some are more, some have been more popular, republished in recent years. In any event, he there's in the book he has quite a few interesting chapters that covers different elements of his life, times, and legacy. And I want to proceed somewhat chronologically, but zoom in on a few different aspects of his life, which Henkin and Eliezer Brud put together in the book as interesting highlights, so to speak, of his life. One of them is a very interesting saga that either happened or didn't happen, but is part of the story of the Aruch Hashulchan, and that is his legendary meeting with the Tzemach Tzedek of Chabad, the third leader and Rebbe of Chabad, Rabbi Nachum Mendel Schneerson, the Tzemach Tzedek, the son-in-law of the Mittler Rebbe, the second Rebbe of Chabad, and the grandson of the founder of the Chabad dynasty, the Alter Rebbe, the Baal Tanya. So the Tzemach Tzedek was one of the undisputed leaders of Russian Jewry during the mid-19th century, very, very prominent and important leader in every respect, in rabbinical leadership, in the changing modern times, in dealing with the Czarist government, and all that entailed, and in psak and halacha and chasidus, in leadership and everything. The Tzemach Tzedek is a fascinating story in his own merit. And when the Aruch Hashulchan was appointed rabbi of Novozybkov, it was, like I said, 1864, so this was shortly before the passing of the Tzemach Tzedek, who passed away in 1866, less than 2 years later. And in his last years, he was quite sick. He was ill. He almost did not meet with people. He was unable to. He was very weak. So he was secluded, the Tzemach Tzedek. So the fact that the Aruch Hashulchan was able to meet with him at this time was something special, and he was encouraged to do so by his Hasidic members of his community. So to go to Lubavitch, which is not that far from Novozybkov, and to meet with the Tzemach Tzedek. So, how do we have this story, and what's the whole dispute about this story? Is that the main source of the story is told by his son, the Aruch Hashulchan's son, the Torah Tamima, the Reb Baruch Halevi Epstein, who writes about it in his memoir. He wrote a 4-volume memoir, the Makar Baruch. This is a very, very famous memoir. He wrote it in, I think, the 1920s and 30s in stages, and volume 3 is ostensibly about his father, but about a good chunk of the whole volume is about this meeting that his father had with the Tzemach Tzedek. In other words, it's like it overwhelms almost everything else that happened in the Aruch Hashulchan's life in the Makar Baruch's eyes. He describes this meeting with the Tzemach Tzedek, and according to the Makar Baruch, he spent well over a month there in Lubavitch, and he met with the Tzemach Tzedek every single day, and they spoke for hours and hours, and they covered literally every topic under the sun, both in Torah and in leadership and in rabbinics and in history, and they discussed everything. And the Makar Baruch has dialogue. He literally has, in quotation marks, dialogue, what they said and how they said it, and he describes, facial expressions in incredible detail, which is part of the question as the authenticity of the whole tale. So many have cast doubts as to the authenticity, the veracity of the account that the Makar Baruch has in general about all his memoirs, and some have been more extreme in expressing their doubts at what he says there, and others have been more accepting of the stories brought out in the Makar Baruch. There was a famous Lubavitch researcher, very important and prestigious researcher, who wrote incredible works and books and essays, Rabbi Yeshua Munshine of blessed memory, and he was very, very sharply critical of the whole Makar Baruch. He scoffed at anyone who relied on the Makar Baruch as a source for anything. He said he made up everything. It's all hogwash and all made up and ridiculous, and how can you rely on the Makar Baruch for anything? And it's a completely unreliable source. And specifically, he unpacks this whole meeting with the Tzemach Tzedek, and he says it was lo'haya v'lo nivra, it never happened. The whole thing is a figment of the imagination of Reb Baruch Epstein, that his father met with the Tzemach Tzedek, and he gives a long litany of reasons why it can't be that it is so. So, with all due respect to Yechiel Michel, and I greatly respect him, I read his books and I love his research, but it seems unlikely that he would completely make it up. Makar Baruch exaggerates lots of things and changes details and is inaccurate in many things, but to completely make up something that he spends literally like 200 pages on in his memoir seems a bit far-fetched, and Henkin goes with this approach as well, that the meeting definitely did take place, but it seems like the Makar Baruch himself knew that he was exaggerating it, because it's ludicrous to say that Rav Baruch Epstein, when his father told him the story of his meeting with the Tzemach Tzedek, obviously the Makar Baruch himself was not there; he wasn't present when they met with the Tzemach Tzedek, but his father told it to him many years later. So it's unlikely, and it's ludicrous to think that the Aruch Hashulchan told his son the exact conversations that took place over a month, with the exact wording and the exact facial expressions and hand motions, and the Makar Baruch remembered every single word that his father said, and 30 years later, when he's writing his memoirs, remembered everything exactly and perfectly and wrote down word for word what the old dialogue was. So it's unlikely that even he himself believed that. So he was using literary license, we'll say, and everyone has a right to use literary license, and to make his book more interesting and to make it more fun to read and exciting, and it's dialogue and it's schmoozing, and he's adding on expression, and which is fine. I mean, as long as you understand that you have to take everything with a grain of salt. So we have to qualify what it says in the Makar Baruch, specifically regarding the meeting of the Tzemach Tzedek and the Aruch Hashulchan. But it seems that the meeting did take place. It probably wasn't a month long. It was probably 2 weeks that he was in Lubavitch. And even during those 2 weeks, he probably didn't meet with the Tzemach Tzedek every day. He probably met him a few times. And they definitely discussed Torah, and they definitely discussed all kinds of other topics. There's a whole dispute, and Munshine makes a big asik out of this, about what did the Tzemach Tzedek say about the Vilna Gaon. So Henkin and other researchers go with a much more qualified version, that he probably said the Vilna Gaon was a great tzaddik, which we knew even before the Tzemach Tzedek said so. But the Makar Baruch himself writes a much more flowery version of it. He basically says that the Vilna Gaon saved Hasidus, and without the Vilna Gaon's cherem against Hasidus, then Hasidus would have gone way out of control, and unlikely that the Tzemach Tzedek would have said that, but it's very likely that the Makar Baruch wanted that to be said and published, because this was a classic. You have this something very similar in Zichron Yaakov of Yaakov Lifshitz in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. The religious community is on the defensive. The secularization is the biggest threat to religious existence, and it didn't matter so much whether one was a chassid or a misnagid. And there was a lot of apologetics going on to bring about a unification, to close ranks, so to speak, among the religious community at that time. So, everyone helped each other. The Hasidim infused Yiddishkeit with a new avodas Hashem, and a new excitement, a new vitality, and meaning, and the Misnagdim helped Hasidus by putting them in cherem, because that's what saved Hasidus, and everyone lives happily ever after, and now we're all united against secularization. That was basically the theme in the early 20th century. This is the time of Agudas Yisrael, where we have to unify orthodoxy all over against all the secularist elements and the challenges of modernity. So there's a lot of apologetics going on, so it makes sense that things like that would be published. Whether the Tzemach Tzedek actually said that is doubtful. So that's one interesting story of the Aruch Hashulchan's life, that he went to go ahead and meet the great Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, and the two of them having these very interesting conversations. there's another chapter in the book that discusses the Aruch Hashulchan and his stance on Zionism. So I got to be honest, when I first bought the book, I got very excited, because it's always exciting to hear, what chidushim there would be about Zionism and Aruch Hashulchan. And to be quite frank, that chapter was a little bit boring, because the Aruch Hashulchan was anti-Zionist. Well, okay, whoopee-doo, many rabbis were, and it's not much of a chiddush there, right? And he was for the very generic reasons, like pretty much like everyone else, that it was head by very secular people, and it was going to be very secularist in nature, and therefore it's going to be it's not good to have the secularization, like everything else that was secularization at that time, which was a very mainstream position. The reason Henkin, I think, he expresses as such, brings out this point, is because one would have expected different from the Aruch Hashulchan, because a lot of people in his orbit were much more accepting of the Chibas Tzion and later the Zionist movement. For instance, his brother-in-law / son-in-law, the Netziv, was one of the leaders of the Chayvevei Tzion, was one of the leaders of the Chayvevei Tzion movement, which was a proto-Zionist, building the settlements of the first Aliyah, and leading that he was one of the Gaboim, he was one of the heads of it. He wrote a lot in support of it. So the Netziv, who the Aruch Hashulchan was very close with, was very publicly supportive. And here it may be surprising that the Aruch Hashulchan was less so. The Aruch Hashulchan's one of his closest students was Rabbi Yehuda Leib Fishman Maimon, who was the head of Mizrahi. The Aruch Hashulchan's grandson was Meir Bar Ilan, the head of the Mizrahi. So all these people grew up and were students of the Aruch Hashulchan and were very prominent religious Zionists, and his brother-in-law, the Netziv, and other people like that. So therefore, Henkin finds it surprising that the Aruch Hashulchan was still an opponent. So a lot of these things are nuanced, and the Aruch Hashulchan was definitely pro the yeshiv in Eretz Yisrael, and there's all kinds of things that he was supportive of fundraising for the settlement there, and all the halachic considerations, and using a sreigim from Eretz Yisrael and things like that. But as far as the political Zionist movement, he was not enthusiastic, to say the least. What I found to be one of the most interesting stories of the Aruch Hashulchan's life was his relationship to both the Musar movement in general, and specifically with the very famous yeshiva in his own town, the Novardok yeshiva of Rav Yosef Yoizel Horowitz, the Alter of Novardok, which was known as the most radical form of the Musar movement. And what was the Aruch Hashulchan's relationship with him? Now, the Aruch Hashulchan is not part of the Musar movement. He's an old school Litvak rabbinical establishment, Volozhiner, and he's not related to the Musar movement whatsoever. So what was his relationship with it? So in fact, he finds himself right in the middle of the controversy, because when the Pulmus HaMusar, the dispute and the opposition regarding the Musar movement breaks out in 1897, it breaks out in Novardok, or in actually about Novardok more, because of the opening of the Novardok yeshiva of Rav Yosef Yoizel Horowitz, and later it spreads back to Zhamut, to Slobodka, and the splitting of the Slobodka yeshiva. And there's a big dispute on the pages of Hamelitz newspaper of many rabbis signing against the Musar movement, and then many rabbis signing for the Musar movement. And the Aruch Hashulchan is actually one of the rabbis who signed to defend the Musar movement against the ones who were opposed to it. So it's very interesting. So he and many, many other rabbis, and in fact he's one of the main ones who speaks out in favor of it. He may not have been a student of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, and he may not have subscribed to the Musar movement personally, but he didn't see anything wrong with it, and he writes clearly in that letter that he, in support of it, that he says they're only doing good things, they're only doing wonderful things. He writes very positively about it, and pretty sharply worded against the rabbis who were opposed. Very, very sharp, actually, and almost uncharacteristically sharp about the rabbis of Rav Bobruisk, the rabbi of Tavrig Rav, who was one of the leading opponents of the Musar movement. And the Aruch Hashulchan writes a very sharply worded letter against him. How can you be opposed to it? And it's terrible, it's a disgrace what you're doing. And very much defending the Musar movement. But even more interesting is his specific relationship with the Novardok yeshiva. Rav Yosef Yoizel Horowitz, the Alter of Novardok, was considered the greatest radical of the Musar movement, the radical Musar of Novardok. And I think I had an episode about Novardok in the past. I don't remember. I think I did. If not, I should. Maybe even if I did, we should have more. It's such a fascinating story, Novardok. And Rav Yosef Yoizel Horowitz himself in his personal life, he experienced all kinds of controversy because of his aesthetic practices and his isolation from society in the forests outside of Kovna for a period of several years. And he was considered as someone who was very extreme in his behavior and his educational philosophy and in what he wanted to implement as the Musar policy in the education of his yeshiva and the curriculum in the yeshiva. And here he establishes the yeshiva in Novardok, and it has to be with the support of both townspeople, the townspeople's leadership, and the rabbi. And in fact, he does. And the Aruch Hashulchan held Rav Yosef Yoizel Horowitz in very high esteem. And the fact that the Novardok yeshiva was successful and grew and flourished during those early years was because of the Aruch Hashulchan. I think this is an unknown aspect of the history of Novardok, that the Aruch Hashulchan gave his full backing, not only to the yeshiva, but also to the personality of the Alter, of Rav Yosef Yoizel Horowitz, and he was very impressed with him. And the Aruch Hashulchan, in fact, took responsibility of the yeshiva. He fundraised for the yeshiva. The townspeople of Novardok welcomed the yeshiva. They took care of it. They themselves came up with a lot of the funding that the yeshiva needed in those early years, helping them with the building, helping them with the fundraising, with the food, housing the students of the Novardok yeshiva, which was relatively small in the beginning, and partly it was married students as well. There was a kollel in the early years of Novardok too, and the Aruch Hashulchan even delivered shiurim in Novardok yeshiva from time to time. It was almost like it was his yeshiva, and Rav Yosef Yoizel Horowitz had this arrangement that the Aruch Hashulchan one was basically overseeing it and in charge. In fact, the mashgiach in the early years, the first decade or so of the existence of Novardok, was Rabbi Leo Dov Berkovsky, who was very close with the Aruch Hashulchan, knew him from Volozhin, and that was more of the Aruch Hashulchan's staff member, meaning he came from that end, and it was more his type. And in fact, what Henkin shows in this chapter is very fascinating, is that all of the sources that describe the extremism of Novardok and their style in Musar and the interesting and somewhat eclectic practices of the Novardok style Musar, and almost all of them, he shows how they came from much later periods in time, either from interwar Poland, when there was many branches of Novardok across Poland and even beyond the Baltic states as well, or from the later years of the Alter of Novardok, way after the passing of the Aruch Hashulchan, way after 1908. Some of them are in the last years of the Aruch Hashulchan's life, after the 1905 revolution, failed revolution in Russia, which greatly impacted the Alter of Novardok's educational philosophy. He copied a lot of the revolutionary activities of the youth from the 1905 revolution and basically implemented them in his Musar yeshiva, which is a great paradox of Novardok. So it was either in the last years of the Aruch Hashulchan's life, when he was already elderly and not so well, or it was afterwards. It was in the last years before World War I, or it was even during World War I when the Alter left Novardok altogether, and in Hummel and later in Kiev, and they opened branches all over Russia during and after World War I, during the years of the Revolution, the Civil War, until the passing of the Alter in Novardok in 1920, and then his son-in-law Rav Yafin smuggles everyone over to Poland for the interwar period. But during the early years of Novardok, it was almost like a mainstream yeshiva. We see that in letters that the Aruch Hashulchan wrote. He describes the yeshiva. He describes his relationship with the yeshiva. He says they're learning like every other yeshiva, and they have a half hour of Musar every day, which is standard for Musar yeshivas, but nothing more than that. And not only that, but many of the students who came to study in Novardok during the early years came to do so because of the Aruch Hashulchan. In other words, they came because they wanted to learn halacha and they wanted to become a rabbi, so they wanted to have smicha from the Aruch Hashulchan, so they came to study in Novardok yeshiva for half a year, 2 years, in order to be tested by the Aruch Hashulchan. So you had a lot of these kind of like mainstream aspiring rabbis who were coming to study in Novardok because of the hope that they would receive smicha from the Aruch Hashulchan. So the influence of the Aruch Hashulchan in the early years of Novardok was, arguably greater than that of the Alter of Novardok, or maybe we'll say differently. We'll say that the Alter of Novardok himself didn't implement what Novardok later became renowned for. It's certain radicalism, certain extremism, a certain different kind of Musar philosophy that the Alter had and became famous for was only implemented later on, not during the years of the Aruch Hashulchan's lifetime, when he was kind of like this tempering influence on the yeshiva. So that's a very fascinating story. Another story of the Aruch Hashulchan's life is the publication of his sefer, his magnum opus, the Aruch Hashulchan, which I mentioned before, which is this ambitious project, multi-volume, covering every single area of halacha. And completely, it was modeled somewhat on the style of the Levush and of the Shulchan Aruch Harav of the Alter Rebbe, but it was much larger in scope. It was covered, like I said, every area of halacha. It also discussed each area, each section, all the opinions of the Rishonim, and it brings it down to the halacha l'maisa. The Aruch Hashulchan also values, as a community rabbi, he values the custom of the people, the custom in Lita, the custom that he witnessed with his own eyes, and tries to defend the custom whenever possible, even when it's seemingly against a mainstream psak of halacha. He very often would try to defend the custom, the prevalent custom among the Jewish communities that he lived in at the time. The main story that I'm not a big halacha guy, so I'm not going to analyze the different psakim in the Aruch Hashulchan itself. We'll leave that for the Talmidei Chachamim around. But I find it a very interesting story of how it was published, how he went about the publication. He wanted to self-publish. In other words, he wanted to finance the entire publication himself. And that was one reason why it took decades to do, and also a lot of heartache. It was very, very difficult, really, really challenging. He had a brother. The Aruch Hashulchan had a brother who lived in St. Petersburg, outside of the Pale, and his brother helped him. He tried to get it published in St. Petersburg. His brother tried to get it through the censors quicker in St. Petersburg, so he got his assistance there. But it was published not only in St. Petersburg and Warsaw and Piotrków and a bunch of other cities. And the main problem that he had was financing. The second challenge that he had was the censor, the Czarist Russian censor, which was very concerned about having the Jews having their independent halacha, especially in the realm of choshen mishpat. What do you mean? Choshen mishpat means that the Jewish rabbis are they're saying that you can do all these monetary law that are against the law of the land, against the Czarist law. So because of that, the Aruch Hashulchan had, and I don't think it's in the current publications of the Aruch Hashulchan, but in the first printing of the Aruch Hashulchan, it has a amazing page, introductory page. The first volume that he published was the Choshen Mishpat, which is the problematic volume. It talks about all the monetary law that might potentially clash with Czarist Russian law. And he has this introductory page that he calls Kavod Melech, in honor of the king. And it's this effusive praise to Tsar Nicholas the second, maybe Tsar Alexander the Third. I don't remember which one it was. Either way, Tsar Alexander III and Tsar Nicholas II were both awful for the Jews. Talking about the after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, who was relatively more benign, even though no czars were really wonderful to the Jews. But after his assassination, so it's the pogroms in the 1880s and the May laws and all the restrictions on Jewish life, and really terrible time for Russian Jewry, these two czars. And he's writing this praise and the Tsar, and he's so wonderful, and his laws are so just, and everything about him, and may he be blessed, and his family, and his kingdom, and incredible. And it's so obvious that what the Aruch Hashulchan is doing is that he really wants this to be published in his lifetime. He wants many more volumes to be published, and he doesn't want the censor to be so strict with him. Unfortunately, it did not work, and the censors were still very strict with the Aruch Hashulchan, and there's all these stipulations that they forced him to write in that obviously none of this is relevant because Dina de Malchusa Dina, the law of the land, is applicable. And obviously all of this is theoretical. And obviously this is only applicable in other countries where we don't have such a kind and benevolent ruler like the Tsar. Or this is only in ancient times when Jews suffered under their kings, but now we live under the Tsar, so none of these halachas are relevant. And he had to write that literally tens of times throughout the multi-volume sefer of the Aruch Hashulchan. So that was the heavy hand of the Russian censor. And it's a very good historical study because since there's this, delayed publication, he publishes over 30 years from the 1880s until his passing, and then his daughter continues publishing it for the next, his daughter and his grandson, Rameir Bar Ilan, publish it for the next 30, 40 years. They publish many, many more volumes and republish old volumes, and it's a bestseller. Many of them go through several printings and very, very popular. It gains instant popularity. It becomes across the rabbinic world, even far out of Russia, Galicia, Hungary, United States, Israel. It really spread in his own lifetime and definitely beyond. It was an incredible success. But you see throughout the publication about how things change. Their financial situation changes. You see how the censorship changes, that the more liberal censorship later on. And then, of course, in the later years, there's no Tsar altogether, so they're able to publish out however they want. So that's a very interesting study. Another aspect of the Aruch Hashulchan is that many like to compare the Aruch Hashulchan to the Mishnah Brura, which is the other great halachic work that is published in the exact same years, literally the exact same decades that they're being published at the same time. The Mishnah Brura, of course, is of the Chavetz Chaim, and the two Sfarim are both on halacha, but they're very, very different in style. First of all, the Aruch Hashulchan, like I said, covers every single area of halacha, whereas the Mishnah Brura is only one section of Shulchan Aruch, the Aruch Chaim. But even in those two, so the Mishnah Brura never quotes the Aruch Hashulchan. He published his after, it was slightly afterwards, but the Aruch Hashulchan does occasionally quote the Mishnah Brura. He quotes him about 30 times, which means that he held him in quite high esteem because the Aruch Hashulchan Kemat doesn't quote from contemporary sources, and he disputes him on many occasions, and the different styles led to the Mishnah Brura's popularity because the Mishnah Brura is much clearer, much easier to read. The Mishnah Brura is written for the masses, where the Aruch Hashulchan is more rabbinic in style. It was written more for Torah scholars, for rabbis, not easy accessible for the masses as the Mishnah Brura. So that's very interesting to track those two publications and how they play off each other. Another interesting thing that Henkin brings. He cites his great-grandfather, Rav Yosef Yoizel Henkin, was a great posek, and a few others. He brings there a few others, but primarily it's his own great-grandfather. He says that if there's a dispute between the Mishnah Brura and the Aruch Hashulchan, then one is supposed to paskin like the Aruch Hashulchan. He's considered the posek achrein more than the Mishnah Brura, which is an interesting position. I think others dispute that position, and this is a very good yeshivish topic of the Mishnah Brura versus the Aruch Hashulchan. Others say because the Aruch Hashulchan was a community rabbi, so he dealt with halacha in a very real and active sense, whereas the Mishnah Brura was writing it more as a scholarly individual using the text and the library and not real halachic questions that he was posed to because he did not serve as a community rabbi, whereas others will say, no, but the Mishnah Brura was accepted by the Jewish people as the basis of all halacha, at least in Aruch Chaim, because he's not on the other parts of Shulchan Aruch, like the Aruch Hashulchan is, and that is a dispute that's probably going to go on for eternity. The last thing I want to mention is how Henkin brings in one of the appendixes about some of the famous people who received smicha from the Aruch Hashulchan. Like I said, so it's part of his legacy, not only his written legacy, but who he gave smicha to, because many of the great rabbis and Torah scholars and leaders and poskim of the next generation received their smicha from him. He has Rabbi Zalman Meltzer, Rabbi Yosef Leo Henkin, Rabbi Cheskel Abramsky, Rabbi Shlomo Yosef Zevin, Rabbi Yosef Shlomo Kahanim on the Panovich Rav, and many, many, many other rabbis. He has a long list of rabbis there. And one of the most important ones he has is Rav Yitzchak HaKayin Kook. Rav Kook himself received smicha from, before his first rabbinical position in Zoimel, later on in Bobruisk, but the first one was Zoimel. He basically, on the way to Zoimel, he got smicha from, meaning they already appointed him as rabbi. He was recognized as a young budding Torah scholar and great posek, but he didn't officially have a smicha rabbinical ordination document. So Rav Kook wanted to get one, so he basically got, Henkin brings a few versions of the story, but he proves that this is the one that's correct, seemingly. And he says that Rav Kook stopped on the way to get the smicha from the Aruch Hashulchan. Not only that, but that is the only smicha that Rav Kook ever got. In other words, this is Rav Kook's smicha. So Rav Kook's rabbinical career and his rabbinical, his title as rabbi comes from the Aruch Hashulchan and no one else. This is a little bit of the story of the Aruch Hashulchan. This is Yehudi Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehudigeber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe. You can and should subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on your favorite podcast platform. Spread the word to your friends and family about Jewish History Soundbites. Leave a rating and a review if you can to help out the podcast and spread the word. And I hope you enjoyed.